We now move on from having had a brief look at some of the phenomena for which a theory of pragmatics has to account to some preliminary thoughts about how a theory of pragmatics might go about that. So this is a lead-in to relevance theory, and once we've explored that, we'll see how relevance theory explains the kind of things that we've been looking at, deictics and irony and so forth. So this is based on Kuiper and Allan, Chapter 9, 2.1. So let's start by something very, very general, but something we easily take for granted. All of us live with a cognitive environment. And you'll notice that there are two parts to that. There's the environment and there's the cognitive bit. Obviously, there's a world out there that we live in, and it has particular things in it. But in order to live in an environment, we also have to represent it in our heads. So the way we do that is to have a cognitive environment in our heads. And relevance theory relies on the notion that all human beings that are thinking about things and living in the real world have a cognitive environment. That is, they represent the states of affairs that there are in the world outside them, inside their heads. We interact with the world, and we live in a world in which we use our senses to pick up on what is in the world. That world is different for dogs. Dogs have much better high-frequency hearing than us, so their cognitive environment includes a whole range of sounds that we can't hear. We are restricted to some extent by the fact that we have the sense organs we do, and that they represent things to us in the way that they do. We see in colour. Apparently, cows and bulls don't see in colour. They have grayscale vision. Well, their cognitive environment would, in that sense, be different from ours. As we go through life, the interaction between us and the world that we live in builds a cognitive environment, a model of the world, if you like, in every individual. And of course, it's not the same for every individual. Some of us have different experiences from others. If you've never seen the Leaning Tower of Pisa and you live in Iceland and you've never heard of it, well, then that's a piece of knowledge that you don't have. You don't know what that tower looks like. You don't even know that it's leaning. If you have been to Pisa or you've seen photographs, then the world that you have is different from the person in the other situation. It doesn't mean that the Leaning Tower of Pisa doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist in the cognitive environment of someone who knows nothing about it. So the world is built up, if you like, directly from experiences that we've had, but it's also built up indirectly by being told about things, and in that sense we have an advantage over cows and bulls who can't have things told to them. They just live in the world of their senses, and they have a cognitive environment which is therefore limited. But we can be told about things and therefore build up a much richer cognitive environment. So in relevance theory, this your cognitive environment is, if you like, the world in your head. And we need a notion of that, because otherwise we can't move on to understanding how it is that we come to understand things. The world in our head is full of what relevance theories call contextual assumptions. That is, propositions in our cognitive environment that we take to be true to some extent or other. So the cognitive environment is a set of propositions, if you like. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Pisa and not in Rome. It leans to a particular degree. It's white or cream or however we happen to represent it, those are all propositions. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Italy. It's in Pisa, in fact. So a proposition like, I live in Fort Worth, is part of the mental furniture of people who live in Fort Worth. Einstein was a physicist. That's a proposition, and it's a proposition about a man called Einstein, and we presume later on that we can identify which Einstein that is from context, and we know what physicists are. One of the crucial things about such propositions is they're held with various degrees of certainty. I don't know exactly what the angle of the Leaning Tower of Pisa is. I don't know whether it's 15 or 20 degrees. I know that it has a lean on it. So if someone says to me, well, the Leaning Tower of Pisa has a 15-degree list on it, well, I'm not sure about that. There's a degree of uncertainty. If we're talking about Albert Einstein, the great physicist, well, I'm pretty sure that he was a physicist and he wasn't a piano player. Well, he might have been a piano player as well, but I know he was a physicist. I'm sure if I lived in Fort Worth that the proposition I live in Fort Worth is 100% certain. I think Albert Einstein was born in Switzerland, but I'm not altogether sure. So there are degrees of certainty with which contextual assumptions are held. Well, our cognitive environment doesn't stay the same. Bits of it may stay the same, but bits of it change from time to time. And when they do, it's the case that sometimes a new proposition is added to your cognitive environment. Someone tells you that with absolute certainty the Leaning Tower of Pisa leans by 16 degrees from the vertical. Well, you can add that to your cognitive environment, and it changes your cognitive environment because you now have a new proposition in there. But it's also possible that on the basis of new experience or something you're told, that the degree of certainty with which you hold a particular contextual assumption can be weakened. You may no longer be quite as sure about things as you were, because either you have a new experience which brings you to doubt exactly what it was you previously believed, or else somebody tells you something and you think, maybe I don't know quite as much about that as I thought. Of course, sometimes a proposition can be strengthened. You're much more sure of it now. You've heard it 4 or 5 times. That's true of some propositions, but not of others. If you hear a politician repeating the same thing half a dozen times, because of what you know about politicians and the way they happen to repeat things, it may not be strengthened. So one of the possibilities for changing the cognitive environment is that it might be strengthened. Well, that's all very well, but we not only have the real world in our head, the world of our experience, the planet Earth that we live in, the universe we live in, but we also represent in our minds worlds that are other than the world we live in. These are often called possible worlds, and we need them because we create those. We have contextual assumptions about possible worlds. In Chapter 9, I talked about the Star Wars movies and what happens in them. Well, we know that they're not the real world. At least I hope we know that they're not the real world and we're not hallucinating. We don't expect on the way to the supermarket to find R2-D2 trotting along in front of us saying, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. We do represent other worlds, and one of the more interesting ones, and I've mentioned that earlier, is we represent the future. Obviously, the degree of certainty that we have about that differs from one proposition to the other. You may be pretty certain that you're going to be in a particular place at a particular time in the future, but there may be other things that you're not nearly so secure in. Particularly, of course, we represent fictional worlds, things that we read about. I'm currently reading a Dickens novel. Well, there are things about the world that I'm reading there, particularly people that exist in that world, who I'm pretty sure didn't exist in the Dickens world of Victorian England. So the world we live in is just one of innumerable possible worlds that we can construct in our heads, and that humans can potentially construct, and we need to account for all of those, because the meanings of what we're talking about don't just relate to the world in which we live, they also relate to possible worlds. Okay, finally, back to semantics. What has all this been about? When we looked at the code, about language itself as a code, and the way in which form and meaning are connected, we said, yeah, there are meanings, and the meanings are a compositional function of the meanings of the words and the way in which the syntax contributes to the meaning of the sentence. But what's meaning itself? How do things mean? And that's an interesting question. And one of the formative theories of the last 100 or so years has been that we need to look at meaning in terms of truth conditions. A truth conditional semantics proposes that the meaning of a proposition is the set of conditions that would need to obtain in a possible world for that proposition to be true. Whoopee, you need to read that half a dozen times. It's quite complicated. What's the import of that statement? Let's have a look at any statement at all. Joe is 36. The meaning of that statement, according to truth conditional semantics, is that there is a world in which it is true that Joe is 36 years old. That's the meaning. In other words, the meaning of as we'll later find, an utterance is what it would be for the world to be having a proposition like that in which that statement is true. So if I said to you, Obi-Wan Kenobi is an uncle of mine, we'd have to find a world in which there was a character called Obi-Wan Kenobi, a bloke, presumably in a cassock of some sort, looking rather like a medieval priest with a beard, etc., who was related to me, was either my mother's brother or my father's brother. If that was true, that would be the meaning of that statement. Let's take another example. The meaning of Albert Einstein was born in Switzerland is the set of conditions that would need to obtain for that statement to be true. Okay, so we need a birth register of young Einstein and find out, yep, he was in Switzerland when he was born. That would be the meaning of the statement. So the set of conditions is there's a person called Albert Einstein, and we have a referring expression there, but we'd need to find its referent, and we'd need to say that particular person was born in a country called Switzerland. And we'd suppose that that was the case in our world, but it might also be the case in some fictional world where Albert Einstein was a character. So there'd need to be a man called Albert Einstein. He'd need to have been born in a country called Switzerland. Those are in the nature, roughly speaking, they're in the nature of truth conditions, etc.